Okay, in this final tutorial in the unit having to do with TV animation, we're going to discuss moving lights. We've already discussed moving the camera, moving objects, and of course making moving texture maps. So we're going to move lights and show you how that can enhance what we're doing. Okay, this is where we left off. Basically we have an animation that ends at frame 600, but really ends at the 500th frame. Basically nothing happens between 500 and 600, and I've reserved that for what we're going to talk about today. And I'm also going to show you another trick. We were using this particular mode of viewing to demonstrate the texture map and how that all worked, but sometimes we want to make things more basic because the computer has to kind of keep up with this stuff. So if you go up to this pull down box here, texture shaded solid, I'm going to change that to wireframe, and the moment I do that the computer gets a break. We can go through this animation and we can see that it's a lot simpler. And I can also even play this by hitting the play button down here, and you'll notice I've also filled in some of the gaps in the animation where we had some moments of darkness, and this is what we're looking at in terms of the TV logo animation. And it'll finish up at that last frame, and then that's where we're going to be working today. So let's say I want to start in the beginning, about where that tower is. And let's say that, I'll go back to texture. Let's say that I want to put some light in that region. So I'm going to go to my items tab and I'm going to add lights. Now there are many lights that we can add. We talked about spotlight in an earlier episode. This time I'm going to talk about a point source of light, which is probably one of the most common ones, at least one of the most common ones that I use. It's a lot of light in a small place. And for what we're doing here, it's going to attract some attention. So if I turn on point light, it will ask me to name it. I'm going to call this L1 for light 1. And this is the only one we're actually going to use, and you can't really see it because it puts the lights in the same place it puts all the new objects. So if I go to perspective view, we can see there it is. So if I zoom in on that, there's the light right there, and you'll notice you can move that. It's got all the handles, and you can see, if I pull that out a little bit, that the light affects the objects. You can see it adding light to the objects, and that's what we're going for. So if we're at frame 0, we're going to start there. If I go back to camera view, I can see there's my light, and what I want that to do is I want that to move around as the camera moves, but not the same place. So let's say it's there, it's lighting up this a little bit. Let's say I move the camera a little bit. So let's say I get to that point, go back to perspective view, and you can see that camera's there. So I'm just going to move the light up, say around there. So that'll be at 46. And let's say now the camera is elsewhere, and it's beginning its sweep of the face. So let's say at that point I want the light to move there. And there the camera is in that position. So I will bring it around here, and you can see the camera, and you can see the light is tracing the image. And then let's say we're further out. And let's say I want to bring the light out too a little bit. So if we're looking at this, we can see the lights kind of following the camera to some. And let's say by the time it gets to around the 400th frame, I want this light to be over here now and back in. But I don't want it behind the object, I want it nice and close. And then at the 500th frame, that's where it becomes important. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a key there. And at 600, I want that to draw across the screen. And that's basically what will happen. So if I look at it in camera view, you can see that the light goes across the words. And to emphasize them a little bit, I'm going to go into Surface Editor. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, on the face, I'm going to raise the specularity and lower the glossiness. That will give that a little bit more of a shine. And I'm actually going to do the same with non-face. I'm going to give it more specularity so that it'll catch that light a little bit more. And same thing with the tower. More specularity and less glossiness. And let's render that and see what that looks like. Okay, as you can see, it does make a difference. You can see where the specularity comes in. We're still getting the animation. We're just sort of muting it a little bit when the light hits it. And then as we go back to the final frame, you can see the light slowly goes across. And we could add sparkles and stuff like that, but I don't think we would need to make our point. We're going to keep it subtle for now. And there we are. So the final step here is going to be to export this not as a movie but as frames. And the reason we want to do that is because, as we said, the video codecs are not all that great in this program, and we also want to make it universal. If you export it as frames, you can do a lot more later than you could if you export it as a video. You only export as a video if you're trying to send something real quick to the client to have a look at it. Alright, so here, if we go into our render and render globals, now the first thing we want to do is to make sure that we have all the basics. We'll go ahead and put that at 600 because that's how many frames we're going to be exporting. And under the camera, we'll see that we're going to up this. We don't want this at standard definition anymore. So we want this at 1920 by 1080. And this will give you high definition quality. And you don't want to make this unusual. You want to make this standard. So 1920 by 1080 is a recognized format. That way it'll look perfectly good on any television screen. And if you wanted to go 4K, you could. This thing will produce anything you want, but let's stick with that for now. And under the output, here, instead of putting it save animation, we're going to save RGB. And so that will give us the ability to create frames. And so, let's create a new folder just for frames, and we're going to call this Tower Logo Frames A. And we're going to hit save, and from there we check our format and we see that it is PNG 32, which is what we want. That way we have the ability to punch out the background if we want to, and pretty much that's it. All we got to do is hit F10 and see what happens. Okay, so here we are, and we can see we have all the frames, and this will be 600 of them. And this will enable us to do a lot when we get to Adobe Premiere to put this all together. But before we're done here, I want to do one other thing first. What I want to do is I want to create an alternate version of this. And this will be a version where we don't have any image mapping, but everything glows. Because I want to start out not with that image. I want to start out with something more neutral. So I'm going to go to Surface Editor. And this might be a good place to save here and then make a new version. I'm going to go to Face, and I'm basically just going to remove all of the mapping. Remove all the textures, and I'm going to put that to a solid white. And I go to Non-Face, and remove that. And I'm going to make that solid white as well. And finally, I'm going to do the same thing to the tower. And that's already solid white, but make sure it's the same solid white. Yes, it is. And so that's basically what that's going to look like. It's going to kind of glow. And one other thing, if we go to the Surface Editor, I'm going to go to each of these things and turn up the luminosity. So they're all basically going to be glowing. And you'll see why in a minute. Okay, then I'm going to go to my Render Globals, and I'm going to keep all of the other information the same, except now I'm going to change the folder. So I'm going to make a new folder called Tower _ logo _ frames B. And that is where I'm going to export this to. And I'll hit F10 again. Okay, and here we are at Adobe Premiere. And Adobe Premiere, once again, is a program that's slightly outside of what we would normally do in graphics and animation, but it's awfully useful. So here, we're going to just make a new project. And at this dialog box, we're going to call this Tower _ logo. And we're going to make sure we know where it's going. Right now that's going where it belongs. And we hit OK. And we get to this dialog box. We're going to name the sequence. Rather than call it Sequence 1, I'm just going to call it Main, which will include basically everything we're going to do here. Okay, so this is the main screen. Down here we have our timeline. There's the project window. There's the picture window. And so the first thing we're going to do is import those frames. So if we do File, Import, you'll see that we have our tile logo frames A. And we're going to take the first one, and like in Lightwave, you have to let it know that you want this as a sequence, not an individual frame. If I just clicked on the first one and didn't do that, it would just put a still image into the project. So I'm going to click this box here that says Numbered Stills, and when I do that, it will load the whole thing. And then, if I drag this into the timeline, there it is. And I can also stretch this out so we can see it better. And you can see, there it is. Okay, so we're going to import the second version of this, Tower Logo Frames B, using the same logic. And I'm going to bring that in. And it's important to understand that since they're done the same way, they're going to give you exactly the same results, meaning the animation is going to be perfectly the same. So I just want to make the beginning part of that white. So let's say at that point, that's where I'm going to stop the effect and go back to the regular. If I hit the C button on the keyboard or grab the razor blade from the toolbox, I'm just going to cut that. And then I've hit the V button, I go back to arrow. I'm going to delete the rest of that. So I'm putting the glow part of this on top of the logo part. So then I'm going to go down here under video transitions. I'm going to go to dissolve, and I'm going to take a cross dissolve and park it right there. I'm even going to stretch that out a little bit. So if we start here, there's white, and then we move gradually to that. And I'm going to go ahead and save the project. Okay, and the final step in what we've been talking about is we want to go to that final image. So I'm going to import just the logo. And I'm going to put that at the end of the line. That's the logo. And I'm going to bring it up into the upper timeline. And so now you can see them both. Anything above is superimposed. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go to Effects Controls, and I want to match that up with the image. So I do that, believe it or not, under motion. I'm going to scale that up a little bit. Now notice how when you do that you can't see it anymore. I'm going to go down here under opacity, and I'm going to bring the opacity down. So that way I can use my positioning tools to get that right about right. I can scale it in a little bit more and position it. And that's probably good enough for our purposes. So then I put the opacity back, and I'm going to create a new color matte, and I'm going to make that a solid white. And I'm going to put that above everything. I'm going to put that below everything. So, yeah, that'll work. Okay, so essentially, we're going to go from that to that. And to do that, I'm going to simply dissolve there. Dissolve, and I'll use a dissolve on the color matte too. So at the end of the animation, we go back to the logo. And what animation would be complete without a little music? So if I import let's say I try that one. I put that on the timeline. It starts with a nice beat. I'm just going to line that up with the beginning of the show, and I'm going to cut it off wherever it is at the end by hitting the C button. And of course, if this was an actual music score, this would be set up exactly to coincide with the music. In this case, I'm going to go to Audio Transitions and just do a crossfade, and I'm going to fade that out. Make sure the color matte is all the way to the end. And we'll cross dissolve that out at the end. And that should be complete. So to recap, We'll start with the glowing tower. We'll cross dissolve into the animation. Then we cross dissolve into the final logo, and we put that up. And while we're here, let's do one more thing. Make a file, new title, and I'm going to call this Sports Talk. And at this point, it doesn't really matter what font I use, but I want this to match the Methodist University. So I'm going to choose a color. In this case, I actually want it to match the school colors. So I'm going to use the eyedropper tool, and I'm just going to grab that green there. So then, Sports Talk. And I'm going to size it up a little bit. And I'm going to move it around. And let's say that's good enough. Then all I got to do is grab my title and put it up there. And I'll have that dissolving in. Right around there. Probably should move that over a little bit. And that's good enough. So the final thing we're going to do here is we're going to export this. And we're going to do this by doing File, Export, Media. And that gives us this dialog box, which has some important features in it. The first thing we want to establish is the format, which is H.264. There are many other formats. We used this at one point to export as a series of still frames. H.264 is the one you want to choose for standard video. Then, high definition 1080p. And there's many others, of course. You can choose standard definition, PAL for overseas, but let's just stick with high definition. And then we're going to go ahead and make a name for this. We'll call this Final Tower Animation. And in this case, we're going to make sure that we are in fact exporting audio. Export audio, export video, and you can see there's a summary of your video applications, but that's really good enough. So just go ahead and hit export. Okay, and here is the final product. And as you can see, not sure if you can hear that beat. And with a few modifications, I'd say we'd have something.